Secret of the Mimic has been out for nearly 2 months now, and it's a very fulfilling game. It answers a lot of questions and offers plenty of new ones, but it's not so mysterious that we can barely solve anything. It's probably the best recent FNAF game when it comes to how it presents its lore. In regards to the Murray family, I was kind of hesitant to even make a theory on it because everyone has already been talking about it and the game makes it pretty clear cut. But recently, we had the 2-year anniversary of Security Breach's Ruin DLC, and to celebrate, I replayed it. But when I did, I noticed something I've only heard a few people talk briefly about. Branching off from ideas I've heard and building upon theories that I already previously had, I think I've actually solved the Mimic and its connection with the Murray family as well as the Moon.exe minigame, and it's all because of our favorite old candy-serving storyteller himself. So what did he solve? Let's get into it. A couple weeks ago, I hopped into a call with Gibby's Horror Homestead, T-Dreads, and Fazbear Entertainment. Gibby was streaming, which had gotten my attention when I got a bunch of comments on one of my old videos after Gibby reacted to it on stream. Throughout the stream, we had a bunch of conversations about Security Breach and Secret of the Mimic. At one point in the stream, I asked this: where do you guys stand on, like, the Ruin Mimic? Like, is that like another Mimic entirely, or is it like the original one?
I think there's two endos. There's M1 and M2. I think that the consciousness of M1 was then put into the F10 and 4 computer, and then it was left, the M1 endo was locked below in the basement, left to roam down there, and decided, hey, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to wear this big old moon suit. I think that is then the Mimic in Ruin, which is why it looks completely different.
While this theory wasn't really based on Gibby's idea, his mention of the Ruin Mimic possibly being Sleepy Moon definitely caught my eye. There's a few things that Gibby, T-Dreads, and Fazent talked about on that stream, as well as Cool Gamer in the chat of my Ruin stream, some of which I'll talk about in this video. But connecting the Ruin Mimic to Sleepy Moon is an extremely interesting idea to consider when taking into account Candy Cadet's story from Ruin. That Candy Cadet story can be heard by inserting Faz tokens into Candy Cadet, and you can find these tokens in prize boxes throughout the area around him. However, these prize boxes all look like this. At the time of Ruin, this box design was pretty insignificant, but now, with Secret of the Mimic, it seems to matter a lot more. The pattern on this box is actually the carpet pattern in Secret of the Mimic. Considering these boxes contain the Faz tokens, the pieces of Candy Cadet's story, this seems to indicate that the story has something to do with MCM and therefore the Murray family. In addition, 2 of these gifts are found in a large cave with glowing mushrooms and a waterfall based on the Twisted Ones. Relative to where we come from, there is one gift that is right behind the waterfall. The Moon.exe minigame in Secret of the Mimic has a lot of interesting stuff, but one of the main things you have to do in the minigame is find pieces of Moon and bring them all together, completing a statue of him. One of these pieces can be found in a chest behind a waterfall, very similar to the location of that coin in Ruin in a box right past the waterfall. What's interesting is that in Moon.exe, it's a piece of Moon, and in Ruin, it's a piece of a story. This seems to imply that maybe the story has something to do with Moon. Overall, it seems like the story is associated with both Murray's costume manner and Moon. So, bearing that in mind, let's now listen to the story.
Now I will tell you a story about a mother and her little boy who lived alone in a cabin in the dark woods. There was a monster in the woods, but the mother caught it and kept it locked in the basement. The monster always made scary noises at night, but the mother would tell the boy not to worry because it could never get out. Then she would sing the boy a lullaby to sleep. One day, the monster stopped growling and instead listened and learned the lullaby. The next day, when mother went out to find food, the monster sang the lullaby from the basement. The little boy heard the lullaby and opened the door.
On the surface, this story seems to be about the events of Ruin itself. Cassie is the little boy, while Gregory is the mother and the monster is the Mimic. Like the mother, Gregory caught the Mimic and locked it in the basement, but the Mimic learns Gregory's voice, luring Cassie to come down to the basement. I think that connection is very intentional, but bearing in mind the fact that the story seems connected to MCM and Moon in some way, I think there's a deeper meaning than just Ruin itself. The mother in the story apparently sings her son a lullaby to sleep, which the Mimic listened to and learned. This becomes really interesting in Secret of the Mimic. One of the hidden areas of the game contains a sort of maze where we need to grab pieces of a puzzle to unlock David's ball collectible. In this area is, strangely, a giant moon animatronic, but not the one from Security Breach, rather the one from the posters and the one from Moon.exe, Sleepy Moon. And guess what we hear the whole time coming from him?
Lay thee down, now and rest. May thy slumber be blessed.
I'm not a fan of that. So the Ruin story is connected to Moon, and it mentions a lullaby, and in Secret of the Mimic, a moon is playing a lullaby. That's really interesting to consider, but it gets even more interesting when you realize that, like I said, the story in Ruin is all about the Mimic. It listens and learns to mimic voices. That monster is the Mimic, and yet it also seems to be Sleepy Moon. That would seem to indicate that Sleepy Moon is the Mimic, or rather, a Mimic. In the secret ending of Secret of the Mimic, we make our way to David's bedroom. The Mimic begins swapping between its personalities, the calm David one and the murderous and neglectful Edwin one. To calm the Mimic down, we play for him a bedtime story that Fiona read to him to sleep, and M1 listens to Fiona's voice to later become her. Knowing that the monster in the Candy Cadet story is the Mimic, it seems like it's meant to be specifically M1, the Mimic that becomes F10N4, Fiona. Let's go back for a second. The story is about a young boy and his mother living in a cabin in the dark woods. A young boy and mother lines up very well with David and Fiona, especially given the story is seemingly connected with MCM based on the designs of the prize boxes. And in Moon.exe, we can actually make our way into a cabin in the dark woods. And who do we find in that cabin? Sun, whom the parachute ending reveals is actually M1, F10N4, the Mimic as Fiona. The monster also only starts mimicking the mother when she leaves, just like how M1 only started mimicking Fiona after she left. In one of the tapes during the Big Top section, Fiona says that she has to leave to go help the Fall Fest crew. Throughout Help Wanted 2, there's some minigames like Carousel and Phaser Blast that are very clearly carnival themed. However, both of them actually end up burning down. Something else we can find in that game is a Fall Fest poster, showing us that the carnival actually is Fall Fest. With those carnival games burning down, Fall Fest itself seems to have burned down, and now with Secret of the Mimic, we have confirmation. In one of the logs, we hear someone questioning how they're hearing Fiona's voice despite her being dead, wondering why Edwin would have lied about Fall Fest. This tells us that Fiona died at Fall Fest on the day that she left. On top of that, Moon.exe has a statue of a married couple. The man has a bow tie, just like Edwin in pictures we see of him throughout the game, but the woman seems to have been blackened by fire. Fiona just so happened to leave for Fall Fest the same day it burned down, killing her. So what this all tells us is that Candy Cadet's story is all meant to be about David and Fiona. David is the little boy, Fiona is the mother. She leaves, and M1 begins to mimic her and lures David in. But that ending of the story seems to imply that the Mimic killed David. But that can't be true, right? M1's job is literally to look after David, to keep him safe. So why would she kill him? I would have thought this was crazy, and that maybe this theory overall was just wrong if it weren't for only one thing. I've already talked a bunch about Moon.exe in this video. The one thing we know for certain about the story is that Sun is M1, and we know that due to the appearance of Sun on the monitors when we meet M1 in the Underground Freddy's. But then, who is Sleepy Moon? And more importantly, who are we? Throughout the logs in Secret of the Mimic, as well as knowledge we have from the original Mimic story, we know that Edwin builds the Mimic to look after David. But after David dies, Edwin sees the Mimic continuing to act like David and gets angry, so he destroys it and begins freaking out and goes into hiding, because he just can't take it. In the games it is slightly different, and there are a few extra steps, but that's the general plot. The main difference in the games is that the Mimic originally became Fiona, and when David died, she convinced Edwin to make another one for David to become. M1 really wanted David to be replaced by M2, and that alone is really interesting. But it becomes more interesting when we look to Sun in Moon.exe, who we know is M1. Throughout the game, we play with a baby owl and we kinda become best friends with it. When we make it to the cabin, however, we help M2 fix some Fazbear masks, and when we're done, Sun gives us a baby owl mask. When we turn back, the baby owl is gone, and the oven is on. We can ask about him, but Sun just says the baby owl flew away while smiling. Then we put on the baby owl mask and enter the cave. Sleepy Moon sees us and he starts crying, and then he disappears for a while. I'm gonna say that again. Sun is M1. When we turn our back, the baby owl is gone, and Sun gives us his face. She makes us become the baby owl, and in response, Moon freaks out. The baby owl is David. He dies, and M1 makes us become David. We are the Mimic. When Sleepy Moon sees us as David, he freaks out. Sleepy Moon is Edwin. So what does all this mean? Well, Sun is the one who gives us the baby owl mask, and in that minigame, that mask seems to be the owl's actual face, and based on Sun's reaction, it seems very clear she is the one who kills him. M1 killed David, which is also interesting when we consider that M1 was the one that was told to go find David to bring him to the party, and then he dies that day. Why would M1 kill David though, when her job is literally to protect him? Something John fnaf talked about in his Secret of the Mimic theory is how AI sometimes lack human morals and values, which results in them trying to perform the task they were programmed with, but in really extreme ways. We see this in the books with characters like Fetch, who does exactly what he is asked, but he doesn't care who he hurts in the process. It's possible the Mimic is like this as well. M1 was designed to watch over and protect David, but because she's an AI, maybe, like Ultron, her interpretation of how to best protect David was for him to die. Instead of living as a human, maybe she thinks it's best to preserve him as a robot. But the only way to do that was to kill him, then convince Edwin to rebuild him. That's why Fiona is so adamant about Edwin building M2, not to mention turning M2 back into David. In the secret ending, we use the data diver to revert M2 from the Edwin personality back into the David one. That's why the Mimic wanted the data diver in the first place. But we know that Dispatch gets taken over by M1, meaning it's M1, Fiona, who wants M2 to be turned back into David. John talks in his video about how Edwin's creations like the stay-up latte machine and the mycelium men are like this, doing what they're programmed to do, but not realizing the boundaries it should be restrained by. Given all these inventions are clearly meant to inspire Edwin's design for the Mimic, it's very likely the Mimic itself has these same issues. So that being the reason behind M1 killing David makes a lot of sense. Not only that though, while M1 clearly wants M2 to be David, it also seems like M2 himself wants to be David too. The Mimic, while obviously prioritizing acting like the people it witnesses, actually learns to act of its own accord. In the Mimic story, the Mimic starts responding to things David says rather than just simply copying them, which surprises Edwin considering that wasn't something he programmed in. In addition, the Mimic story shows how the Mimic starts acting like David, then witnesses Edwin's aggression and copies that too. Later on, in the Storyteller, the Mimic infects the Glamrock animatronics, only they don't get more aggressive, they just get more childish. They only adopt traits from the David personality. In Secret of the Mimic's secret ending, the Mimic hears Fiona's story and it opens up his chest for us to use the data diver on him, and when we do, he turns back into the David personality. Not to mention, at the end of the parachute ending, the Mimic takes the data diver from us and walks away. To me, it seems like as the Mimic experiences more things, it grows to enjoy certain things too. Its time being friends with David probably had a bigger effect on him than his time with Edwin, so he wants to be David, but he's forced to be Edwin. The rest of the story of the Mimic is pretty well explained throughout the game, and is pretty self-explanatory. A log in the game has M1 asking Edwin to build a type of computer with her quote-unquote cradle program, which is designed to provide boundaries for David that will supposedly keep people safe, implying that when she says David, she means M2. This cradle is Mixes, as both are made to create boundaries for the Mimic. Mixes in Ruin is meant to stop the Mimic from accessing part of the Pizzaplex. We also see in the parachute ending that when we have to activate Cradle.exe, it's at the bottom of a screen which says Mechanical X-Form Experimental Storage, MXES. So it seems that Edwin built F10 and 4 and made it into the Cradle program. Once Edwin finishes the M2 program, the last thing he struggles with is making a body for it. The parachute ending shows us a bunch of smaller mimics made of a bunch of random pieces, but one thing they all have in common is that they're small, child-sized. These were Edwin's prototypes for a body for M2, designed to be about the size of David. After a while, he recognizes that these won't work. If I had to guess, I'd say Edwin, like Henry in the books, needed a way to allow David to actually grow up rather than stay a child forever. Henry's method was to make multiple bodies, but Edwin already has the technology he needed, the original Mimic body, the one he designed with the ability to expand and contract, change its size. That way, over time, David can get taller, he can grow up. That's all speculation, but it makes a lot of sense because we know that M2 is actually in M1's body. We see what M1 looks like in the tapes in Edwin's house, which are before David even dies and before the concept of M2 is even conceived, and M1 looks exactly like M2. On top of that, there's a drawing in the game of David with the Mimic, and that Mimic drawing looks just like M2. We also know that Edwin ends up moving M1 into F10 and 4. Essentially, he turns Fiona into the Cradle program that she had the idea of. Basically, Edwin takes Fiona out of M1 so that he can use that body for M2. This then allows David to have the ability to expand and contract. It also explains the line, "Bring back the sun" from Moon.exe, because Sun, M1, is essentially exiled to live in the cabin, away from Moon, and M1 is exiled to live underground, away from Edwin, leaving him to raise M2 David alone, which of course doesn't go well. He comes to his senses, realizing that M1 isn't Fiona and M2 isn't David, so he beats M2 to a pulp, teaching it violence, and the Mimic begins to mimic Edwin in addition to David. It not only mimics Edwin's aggression though, but also his neglectful nature towards David. M2 ends up doing a power experiment, causing an explosion in Edwin's house, resulting in Edwin being badly hurt and M2 leaving him to die while he finished making himself new legs. And so, that's the full story of the Mimic in the games. But there's one last thing I haven't really touched upon much. What about Sleepy Moon? As I said before, the Candy Cadet story seems like it's about him, but it's also about M1. But M1's body ends up becoming M2, so it isn't able to become Sleepy Moon. So if Sleepy Moon is the Mimic, what Mimic is it? Well, if the Candy Cadet story is about Sleepy Moon, and that story is in ruin right before we meet the Mimic, it would make a lot of sense for Sleepy Moon to be the ruined Mimic. After all, the Ruin Mimic and M1 look completely different. Game theory suggested that Murray's costume manor was just under the Pizzaplex, so the Mimic was down there the whole time and kept replacing different parts of his body with different pieces, but that doesn't really make much sense, because then the Mimic program wouldn't even be left behind, because there's no piece of the original Mimic left in the body, so it doesn't really make sense. So, maybe the Ruin Mimic was another one of Edwin's attempts at making a body for David, but for whatever reason it didn't work, so he scrapped it and it later became Sleepy Moon. However, this is questionable, because it requires the Sleepy Moon Mimic to be a version of M1, despite the fact that we know M1's body was used for M2, and the program was moved into F10N4, not another Mimic body. So it would be weird if M1 somehow found its way into this endo in the first place. On top of that, Sleepy Moon in Moon.exe represents Edwin, yet the monster in ruin is M1 mimicking Fiona, the mother. So if the story is about Sleepy Moon, the meaning of the story would probably have to change completely, having Edwin be the mother instead, catching the monster who is still M1, and locking it in the basement. However, this is problematic because M1 never mimics Edwin, only M2 does. Plus, M1 was trying to convince Edwin to make M2, and he only put M1 in F10N4 after he makes M2. After David dies. So the fact that the mother locks the monster in the basement while her son is still alive just doesn't add up. So while at the beginning of this video I talked about Sleepy Moon being the subject of the story, it's really hard to fully justify that in a satisfying way, unless we are to say that the story has 3 completely different meanings. If that is the case, I'm not really sure what the Sleepy Moon version of the story would imply, so I want to hear from you guys. What do you think the ruined story represents? Do you agree with me that it's about Fiona and M1 killing David, or do you think it's something about Sleepy Moon? Or do you think it's both? I hope to hear your thoughts in the comments, and if you did enjoy this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye guys!